Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
You may wonder sometimes how we decide to select what we're going to speak about. And I'm going to preface tonight's sermon with how I came about what we were going to look at. Every now and then I'll just be roaming for subjects, and sometimes you'll find me just walking the halls, walking the building, looking for things that catch my attention. Well, I made my way in here this week, I believe it was Tuesday, and stopped right there. Lights were off, and the sun was coming in the windows, and it was just perfect. And it made me realize something. This is a special place. This is a place in which we get to gather together to lift our worship up together unto a God that created the entire world, unto a God that cared for us so much, He prepared a plan so that we can be with Him eternally. And that made me look at a few things, and if you get to know me too much, you'll start noticing things that I look at. I start looking at things in buildings and just start looking and start seeing different things, and I realized something. I wonder what it took to build this building. And I sat in this chair that's right behind me and just looked at the building for just a little bit and noticed all of these different things. Noticed the different amount of lights that were in the building and how they were positioned. I started looking at the windows in the back and the doors and looking at all of the windows on the side, looking at how it slopes down. And I realized something. That was by design. Someone had a very good plan when they began to build this auditorium of how it was to be done. And as I was sitting here, it was nice and cold, the heat wasn't on, it was 62 degrees. I began to think, what does it take to build a church? I'm not talking about the physical things. I'm not talking about the windows, the lights, the sloped floor. I'm not talking about what does it take to build the building in which we worship. But what does it take to build this may be the better word for it, congregation of people? What does that consist of? So my mind began racing, all sitting just right here. Where could we go with that thought? How to build a congregation? And my first thought came, I'm not asking the question how to build the church. God had already set that plan in motion. I'm not looking to start a new church. But our thought always should be, how do I build up the church that's been established? Specifically for us, as we were sitting here thinking, how do I build the local congregation here? My mind always generally goes to the Old Testament when looking for ideas or examples because I've just fell in love with the Old Testament. I love it. I love what it points to. I love all the illustrations that are provided there. I love the scenery that's painted in the word pictures for us. So I began to think about Israel and what it took to build those people. I realized something. Those people were just like us. They had average lives. Some of them were very extraordinary, and we think about them quite a bit. But many of them were just average, everyday people just like us. What did it take to build them together? And what did it take to pull them together to get them to keep going? Began to think of all the things in the Old Testament that brought the people together. My first thought was, what was it like when they left Egypt? After they saw all those plagues and Pharaoh pretty much told them, go, get out of here. But that wasn't really the motivation we were looking for. And I began to think on down to Israel's history and began to get into the area where we see them in captivity, late in the game of the Old Testament. And I made my way down to the book of Haggai in my thoughts. Short book, 2 chapters. Chapter 2 is what we're going to center in on tonight. because it's very specific at what happens inside of this book and what we can do, especially asking the question, how does one build or uplift or encourage or edify or strengthen the local body? And we're going to draw some parallels from the entire chapter. And there's a very simple outline we're going to use. Verses 1 through 6, or verses 1 through 9, is going to discuss the former glory of the temple. Verses 9 or 10 through 19 is going to talk about some present blessings that they have. And verses 20 through 23 is going to depict the future blessings. Now, all the way through these three areas, we're going to find ways in which we can be like them, ways in which we can learn from them, and ways in which we can help ourselves here. You know, this is almost the last Sunday of the year. Next Sunday is the last one. So this means next week is the very last time that we get to assemble together on Sunday. It's becoming a time in which we think of those last things of the year. This Wednesday will almost be the last Wednesday, one more after it. So our time when thinking about worship, when thinking about the Lord's body, is drawing near for 2014. And that's how this sermon developed itself. So let's look at these three things and see how we can help each other, because that's the encouragement I want us to have. How do I have these attitudes? Let's begin by looking at the past glory of the temple. And to do so, I want us to look at verses 1 through 3 together in Haggai 2. In the 7th month and the 21st day of the month came the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison as, or of it as nothing? We do need to get a little bit of a background on what's happening. People had been coming back from captivity. They found the temple destroyed. It was laid in ruins. It wasn't a building such as this anymore. It was not whole. It was not complete. To put our minds in the frame of what we need to be looking at, what would it be like if we came here one morning and there was nothing left? Only a little outline of a foundation in which we could see. Only of things of the former days we could remember. So we see where these people begin. But the people were encouraged to come back and to rebuild the temple. That was what the Lord had in mind for them, and that was their goal. After they came back, they began this work some 23 days later, and this is right at the year 520 BC. We get a depiction here in the second year of King Darius' reign. However, they were discouraged. Let me ask us a question. How many times do we get discouraged? How many times do we look back on history and think, oh, it used to be so much better? Or maybe we look back to the former glories of things in which we knew, and we think how wonderful it was, and we stop working, and we stop doing things, and we stop being motivated. We find these people here terribly discouraged. They could see that old temple, verse 3. Look back at that. Who left among you that saw this house in her first glory? The depiction of glory here, it was grand. It was excellent. It was wonderful. It's something that they wanted back. I love the question given now in verse 3. And now, how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison as of nothing? You know, Bible chronology helps us fill in some of the things that's going on here. In Ezra 4, 1 through 24, we find there are those that are getting ready to become the enemies of the people of God. In Ezra 5, 1 and 2, and Haggai 1, 1 through 10, describes how Haggai and Zechariah were all trying to do the same thing. Motivate the people to get back to work. If you go back to Haggai 1, verse 1, in the second year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, the first day of the month came the word of the Lord to Haggai and the prophet Zerubbabel. Notice verse 2. This speak the Lord of hosts, saying, the people say, the time is not come that the Lord's house should be built. There was something specific they needed to get back to work on. Let me fill in some of the gaps of history we're missing. When we look at Haggai 1 through 2, we find and realize they should be building the temple. But as we look through chapter 1, that's not what they've been doing. We find the answer in chapter 2 because they look at the current temple and they see how sad it looks, and it depresses them. It saddens them, and they just don't have the heart to work anymore. They just don't feel like they can keep on going. They see what it used to be, and now it's nothing. You know what they were spending their time on? If we look at the entirety of chapters 1 and chapter 2, the only chapters in this book, we'll find that they were working on their own selves. They were building homes, luxurious homes. And they were building houses that are going to be called sealed homes, nice roofs. But what laid in waste? The Lord's house is going to be depicted here as the one that's laying in waste. But their homes, they were so nice. They wanted to work on them, but they had forgotten about God. I love Haggai chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. That depicts these people. Haggai and Zerubbabel both are trying to get these people to understand. Let's look and see what we're doing. Notice with me Haggai 1, 11 and 12. This will help us with some of the history that's going here. We find here, and I called for a drought upon the land and the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men and cattle, and upon all the labor of the hands. And then we find in verse 12 Zerubbabel here. Then Zerubbabel and Joshua both are being depicted here as the high priest, with the remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him, and their people did fear him. There's a question that's being asked through this particular section. Consider your ways. What are you doing? The Lord's house, it lies in waste. It's not what it once used to be. Where are you focusing your attention? Where are you focusing your time? You know, God was going to declare something to these people when we look at verses 4 through 9 in chapter 2. This current temple in which they're looking at, in which they can't imagine is going to be anything near the first, God's going to tell them, it's going to be better. It's going to be better than you can even imagine, but there's something you have to do. And if you're thinking in your mind right now, just as I am, in the progression of things, what do they need to do? That's what we need to find out. And when we began by asking the question, how does one build up a congregation? How does one encourage? How does one edify? How does one build the local church? The answer is going to be given here. It's going to be the same thing that's going to help them get this temple completed. Yes, I know in Haggai 1 and 2 we're talking about a physical structure. A building such as this maybe. Something that they can complete, and once they're done they could stand back and say, looks really nice, doesn't it? It's something they could stand back and look at all of the pieces. They could look at the beams in a row. They could look at the window structures. They could look at the entryways, and they could say, it's finished, it's accomplished. But for us, when we think about the Lord's body and we start thinking about the church, we're not thinking about this building. Now, I do want to pause our minds for just a minute. I'm not saying in any way, in any shape, or any form that we should let this building go and let it go to ruins, because the church is the spiritual being. It's the collective body of people. We need to keep it up just as we would. But we need to remember that the keeping up of the building and the keeping up of the spiritual body is two different things. That's something they had forgotten. So go back to chapter 2 and let's notice verses 4 through 9. And let's see the glory, or the current glory, of this temple. Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, and be strong, O Joshua, the high priest. Be strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work. For I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. According to that which I have covenanted with you when ye came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you, fear ye not. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, and the sea and the dry land. And I will shake all nations, and desire of all nations shall come. And I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. You know, the remainder of God's covenant here, when we're looking at verses 4 and 5, there's first a reminder here of commendation to Zerubbabel, to Joshua, and all the people that were left. Notice with me verse 4. Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the people of the land. They're told, be strong. I don't know what it was like for them. I don't know what it was like for them to be carried away into captivity, their homes to be destroyed, the one place in which they could come in a relationship with God, the place in which God dwelt, would be destroyed. I don't think we can imagine that. We've been very blessed. Many of our homes are still standing as the day they were built. This building's still here, and it's nice as it can be. It has all the comforts of home. Aren't we warm tonight? We're not out in the cold. If it were raining right now, it would not be raining upon us. We would be sheltered from the weather, from the elements. I cannot imagine what it was like. And it must have been tough. Because here we find the Lord depicting unto these people, be strong. I don't think we carry its weight as much as we do. He said, be strong, for I am with you. And I love the depiction. Saith the Lord of hosts, the Lord of lords, the King in which created the earth, the one in which has carried them out of captivity, which he's going to notice in just a minute. Be strong. The second reminder is really in a review of the past, a review of the things in which they had been through. How many times in the Old Testament, or maybe even in the New Testament, do we find depictions of Egypt and how God took the time to bring them out of Egypt? Let's pause for just a moment to think about what that means. Imagine what it would have taken to get all of those people out of Egypt. Imagine what it would have taken, and this is where their minds would have went, for them to pass through on dry ground through the Red Sea. Imagine all of the hardships they've seen. Verse 5, according to the word that I covenant with you when ye came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among ye, fear ye not. Don't be fearful. Don't stop working. There's something we need to accomplish. So much has already happened for these people, and we're seeing it here. Think about after they left Egypt. This is a history lesson for us. They would have never survived the wilderness if it were not for God. How did they get food? Oh yes, God provided for them. How did they get the necessity of water? God provided that too. Do you remember what they wore, their clothing? This is one of the most fascinating things I find in the Old Testament. Their shoes never wore out. How many times do we have to buy new shoes because our shoes have worn out? And how many years did they wander and never have to worry about that? See, we see all of these things that can happen, and I can only imagine their minds. I remember the former temple. And here the Lord says, remember Egypt. We'll get through this. You know, you can study 1 Corinthians 10 and Psalm 106 that depicts the children of Israel through all of these times. And it's very much like the time in which we find them here in the book of Haggai. They got discouraged and they just stopped. And that's where we find ourselves now. But there's something else happening here in verses 6 through 9, and I want us to notice this. There was a plan for the future, and it involved them. Sometimes people read Haggai 2, 6 through 9 and get a little bit concerned. Is this talking about the end of the world? Is this talking about the end of times? It concerns people. But this is not the same type of language used in areas like 2 Peter 3, 10 and 11. or 10 through 13, which destructs a destruction of the world. But this is something broader in its scope. Notice with me 6 through 10. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once in a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. You may be saying there, but he only talks about this house. How do we know it's not talking about the end of the world? A simple question is going to help us with that. What's going to happen when this world is ended? What's going to happen to it? Will it still be here? Would one be able to, after the end of the world, after Judgment Day is completed, to come back to the earth and say, did a good job with this building? We know, as the New Testament depicts, this earth and all of its former things will be burned up. If you notice in this passage, and we look here and get down to verse 8, the silver is mine, and the gold is mine. These things, after this event has been accomplished, will still be here. So we're not talking about the end of the world. This is a type of language used in the Old Testament that describes the shake and the fall and the rise and the fall of nations. If you go to Isaiah 13 and even in Matthew 24, we can find some similar language. The shaking of the natural world for these things to come out. The desire of nations being depicted here, and the desire of all nations in verse 7, is depicted in the American Standard Version as the precious things of all nations. So all things that have been created, all things that exist, all things that are needed to keep the world going, will line up to make this house a wonderful place. I do want us to notice something in verses 8 and 9 that's specific. And it's something specific to us too. You know, we can physically touch this building. We can physically see a lot of things of this building. But I want to ask us a question. Who owns it? Who owns it? Many things in our world are about ownership. Who owns them? Who owns the land that's under this building? Who owns the building that's newer in the back? Who owns all the contents of money in this room right now? Where do those things belong? It's the same thing being talked about in the book here in verses 8 and 9. For the silver is mine and the gold is mine, saith the Lord. All of these things anyways, they're already mine, and we'll use them to our benefit. Verse 9, the glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. So the new temple that's being built will bring peace. Let's notice our next point. Let's notice verses 10 through 19 and see the present blessings that they had. Now, when we get into this section, we may be thinking, those weren't blessings, Jonathan. Those don't make sense as blessings. It looks more like they're having things taken away from them. But just remember verses 8 and 9. Silver's mine. The gold is mine. And remember why this section exists. I want you to begin by noticing verses 10 through 14 with me. In the present blessings, we have to notice something in which we will not like. There has been a disobedience unto God. In verse 10, in the 24th day in the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, hit the pause button for just a minute. We've seen that phrase multiple times, and I want us to ask something about it. What does that mean? I'm not talking about the dates and the 10th month, and I'm not talking about any of that. Came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, where did this message come from? Did Haggai think this up on his own? Did he go home one evening and chart out what he thought was going to be best for these people? Did he get with Zerubbabel and they sit down, or did he get with Joshua and they sit down and try to figure out, well, what's going to be best? No, this is from the Lord. So continue reading verse 11. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, another depiction of who it's from, ask now the priest concerning the law, saying, if one bear holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and when the skirt does touch bread or pottage or wine or oil or any meat, shall it be holy? And the priest answered and said, no. Then said Haggai, if one that is unclean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be unclean? And the priest said, it shall be unclean. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but when we review it, it will. The prophet was moved here by the Lord to ask two very specific questions. And they're real simple if we break them down. Can holiness, the first question, be passed from an offering to something else? So can something that's been set apart, it's been sanctified, it is holy, touch something else and make it holy? The priest answered no. And we know this is correct because if we go to Leviticus 6, verse 27, we find that is the correct answer. It's impossible for one thing to make something else holy. The second question in verse 13, if someone who is considered unclean, by chance they've touched a dead body, and they touch something else, would they be made, or would that item be made unclean? And the priest said, it shall be unclean. We know this is also the case, Leviticus 21, 1 and 11, even Numbers 6, 6 through 8. There was a purification they needed to go through after they touched a dead body, or something that was considered unclean. It just happens to be the example that we're seeing here. There was a situation that had brought uncleanness in the land. It was among the people. Even in the midst of them offering their sacrifices unto the Lord, remember, the temple lay destroyed, but their homes were built as new. God regards these people unclean, is our conclusion of the matter. And their sacrifice is also unclean. Verse 14 is going to depict that. Then answered Haggai and said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord, and so is every work of their hands, and that which they offer is unclean. So the disobedience. Let's flip that coin. Let's see the obedient, verses 15 through 19. Haggai asked them now to look back at some things after they had returned from Babylon and captivity. He's going to point out that their blessings were so hard to receive. When they needed grain and they expected 20 measures, they were only able to get 10. When they needed oil and they expected 50 measures to be given by the press, there was only 20. There was a purpose of these hardships. Notice with me 15 and 16. And now I pray you consider this day and upward from before a stone was laid upon a stone in the temple of the Lord. Since those days were when one came to a heap of 20 measures, there were but 10. When one came to the press fat to draw out 50 vessels out of the press, there were but 20. Notice verse 17 through 19 as well. I smote you with blastings, with mildew, and with hail in all your labors of your hands. And ye turn not to me, saith the Lord. Consider now from this day and upward, even from the 24th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it. Is the seed yet in the barn? Yea, as the vine. And the fig and the pomegranate and the olive tree hath not brought forth. From this day I will bless you. Where were these blessings going to come from? I know the easy answer is from God. But what was it going to take to achieve these blessings? What did they need to do? There was a foundation that needed to be laid. There was a temple that needed to be built, and they were to consider their ways. Remember, these people were destroyed. They were hurt. They were damaged. I want to ask us a very specific question. When they stopped doing the work and things got harder, and they kept forgetting to go to God to pray to Him, to ask Him for blessings, why would we try to do the same? I'm not saying that all the time we're just like these people. We've got a foundation to lay, we've got a temple to bring up, and we're not doing it. But sometimes when we think of the account and we start thinking of the question we began with, how do I build up the church? The easiest answer is, in their case, they needed to get to work. There's something that needed to be accomplished. They needed to finish the task. The Lord told them He'd bless them if they do it. Now, I want us to ask us a question. What happens when we do the work? What happens when we do the work in which the church was designed? What happens when we're concerned about evangelism? What happens when we're concerned about each other, building each other up? How many of you have been discouraged this year in 2014? It'd be easier to ask this question. Raise your hand if you weren't discouraged in 2014. We'd see just what we see now. In some way, in some form, in some shape, we've been discouraged, we've been let down, we've been trodden on. There's a work to be done. There's an encouragement to be given. There's a kind word to be passed, a compliment to be had. There's plenty to do. But sometimes we don't. Because sometimes we, just like these people, are discouraged. The end result for them was not good. Let me tell us what happens when we do what the Lord asks us to do. And I'm going to do it in this manner. Number one, I want to thank you for being here tonight. Because it's encouraging to me to see people that want to spend their time with the saints of God, assembled together to sing praises unto Him, to lift prayers unto His throne, and to study His Word. That's encouraging. If you were to look around, you would see the same thing. There's something else that's been encouraging tonight, and I hope you've noticed it as well. I'm going to show you something that's encouraging during the worship assembly. When we spend some time in this Word and we can hear those pages turning, we know where we find ourselves. These people had a work to do, but you could not hear the hammer. You could not hear the chisel laying out block, but all was silent. And what did they do? They stayed at home and never accomplished the work of God. You see, when we follow the examples given in the New Testament, we can be like Acts 2:47, where the Lord is going to add daily to His church as such would be saved. You see, we have a part in it, and God's going to fulfill His obligation. When one becomes a member or chooses to become a member of the Lord's body, who's going to add him? It's not you and me. We don't get to vote. It's not the one that lays this man under water and baptizes him for the remission of his sins. That's not the one doing the adding, but the Lord will. It wasn't going to be the ones who were going to lay that foundation that were going to finish and accomplish and fill this temple with glory. The Lord was going to do that. The only thing He asked these people to do was to finish their work, was to finish what was set out before them, was to have the mind to consider their ways. There's one other thing we need to notice, and this will bring this sermon home to us, and then it will be yours. The very last verses in this chapter, from verse 20 on down to verse 23, and some very intriguing things are going to happen here about future blessings. Read with me. And again the word of the Lord came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots, and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down, and everyone by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son, saith the Lord of hosts, and will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. You see, reading that, we don't see much into it until we start trying to figure out what the ins and outs are happening here. What would we call ourselves as a group of people? Some of you may say we're the Lord's body. Some of you may say we're the church. Some may say the kingdom of God, and all are applicable. But I like to call us the future blessings from Haggai 2:20 through 23. There was something greater coming. Even though they did not see it in the scheme in which they were at, even though they did not understand after the temple was built there will be glory in this temple, but there's something bigger coming. When we look at verses 20 through 22, this is simply applied to the overthrow of the kingdoms, just as in the beginning in verses 5 through 9. There was something going to happen. And as we look at history, that's simply to be had. We think about the Assyrians who were destroyed by the Babylons who were destroyed by the Medes and Persians. The Greeks are eventually going to overthrow the Persians as they become from Medes and Persians just down to Persians. The Romans are later on going to take the Greeks, and the Romans eventually are going to be destroyed on their own. There's a rise and fall to nations. There was a plan in place. Inside of all of this destruction, inside of all of this that people may not understand, something was going to come. A blessing for all people was going to be had. And we find it in verse 23. Read that one with me again. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, I will take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, saith the Lord, and will make thee a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. I call this in our discussion the recognition of the future blessings. There is a singular honor being placed upon Zerubbabel here. As we make our way and we think about the promise that was made or given to David in 2 Samuel 7, 11 through 6, we find there was a promise of a future kingdom to be established, something we would call the Lord's body. We may not see it here in verse 23, but as you look at the grand picture of things happening in the Old Testament right here, we're going to find something interesting. We don't find any other depictions of a seed line at this point, except Zerubbabel. He's the only one in this scheme of time in which we can see. He's the same one found in Matthew 1 as a part of the seed line of Jesus, the seed of David being given. And he says he's going to make him a signet, which means he's going to make him a sign. When I think of this word, I think about someone who's going to get something approved, maybe officially, and we'll go and have someone sign their name and stamp it. Nowadays, it's a rubber stamp or an ink stamp, and it doesn't really make the same effort. But if you remember, they used to have those metal stamps, and they'd sign it, and they'd place that stamp in there, and they'd push the handle down, and it would force their logo, their symbol, their sign upon that paper. And it would forever be placed upon that. That's the same thing being mentioned here of the signet. Most likely this was a ring or something wore around the neck in which one could make an official document from the king, or they could place that down on that paper and permanently inscribe it in that paper. It could never be rubbed flat. It could never be taken out. You would always see it. There's something greater coming when we get to the end of Haggai chapter 2, verse 23. And we find as we look in the scheme of things, something greater came, so that everyone that has lived may have the opportunity to come unto the Lord. You know, we're talking about work tonight. We're talking about the Lord's body. We're talking about what we can do. Let's ask the question, how does one build up a congregation? You may have many ways in your mind right now, but I think we all understand the point that's being made. The same way they were going to finish the temple is the same way we're going to build each other up. It's the same way in which we're going to encourage each other, and it's the same way we're going to get the work in God's kingdom finished, complete, accomplished. It's a real simple answer. It's time we just finish the work. That was the answer that was given unto these people. Consider your ways and work. That's what they needed to do. So when we think about ourselves and we think about that question that we began with this morning, that started in a chair up front, how do we build up the Lord's body? I need to work.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven,